These are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to Part 3 of the Preservation Week web series, the Disaster Relief Question and Answer webinar. I'm Allison Armstrong, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and will be your host for this afternoon's webinar. Our presenter today is Nancy Kraft. She's the Head of Preservation and Conservation at the University of Iowa Libraries. Nancy has assisted in many disaster recoveries, large and small. She is active in ALA and is a board member of the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield, a nonprofit organization committed to the protection of cultural property worldwide during armed conflict. I'm joined by Jessica Bitely, a member of the Preservation Week Committee and the Director of Preservation Services at the Northeast Document Conservation Center. Today she'll be moderating the Q&A and contributing to the conversation with Nancy. A few things to keep in mind for today's presentation. If you wish to comment on today's presentation using Twitter, you may use the hashtag you see on the screen. However, we will not be monitoring the Twitter feed. Today's webinar will be driven by your questions. Please type your questions for Nancy into the question box on the control panel on your screen. Any questions which remain unanswered while we're on the air will be answered offline, and the answers will be sent to all attendees. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and evaluation within 2 days. Please take time to fill out the evaluation form, since it will be used by the committee to plan future events. There may be a slight delay as I turn the presentation over to Nancy.
Hello, welcome. I'm just showing you this box here for questions so that you can find it on your panel for asking questions, and I encourage you to do so. I thought what we would do is start with an icebreaker to get us all acquainted with each other. We're going to do a poll, and the poll is going to ask you questions about the size of disaster that you have been involved in, whether it's been minor, tiny leak, or moderate where you needed to freeze things, major, or catastrophic. So if I believe someone at ALA is going to launch the poll for us. So if you just take a couple minutes to vote, be interesting to see where everyone is on this. And I see that I did not leave none. Okay, it looks to me like 79 to 80. So most of us on the screen have on this session have done at least a small disaster. Several of you have unfortunately dealt with moderate, and a few of you with major. So, but thankfully no one here has had to deal with catastrophic. For those of you that are wondering, at least with my first disaster that was beyond a tiny pipe leak, I lost a little bit of time trying to figure out what size of disaster I was dealing with and how to deal with it. So this is a nice chart that I've found that helps define and walk through the different types of disasters and how you're impacted and what resources. I just find this a nice little chart to kind of help if in a disaster. I had a question in advance about online and digital. So I thought I might do that, and then I'll turn it over to the Q&A. So there are a couple things. There are two kinds of, I guess, digital resources we need to think about. One of those are the online access points that we provide to our users and staff. And this is just a way to think about how to prioritize. What are the services that you need to have, that you really need to get back up and running in less than a day? And this may be, it probably is communication with staff. And then what is essential to keep yourself going and needs to be up in 2 to 4 days, what's necessary and what can be delayed. And some of the things that we found were easy to bring back up were like our online, some of our online research sources. So these are things to think about, just to keep yourself going and keep your community in contact. Another one is for preparing for digital disaster, which is really more difficult, I think, because we're just not quite there yet. But here are 3 resources that I've found nice to refer to, and this will, of course, be, you won't need to copy these down because you'll get this later. And then I like to refer to this chart by the National Digital Stewardship Alliance, who I think are now working on a level 0, but this level here, protect your data, these are really good places to start. And remember, taking 1 or 2 tiny steps at a time. It will take, I don't know that anyone is really way over to level 4, but if you concentrate on level 1 and getting 2 copies that aren't co-located, and really concentrate on this for your first step, that should get you a long way towards protecting your digital assets and being prepared for disaster. But it's a step at a time. So I think now we're ready to plunge into some of the questions that might be out there.
Okay, this is Jessica Bitely speaking, just so everybody knows my voice. Before we actually start with questions, I want to second Nancy's support of this National Digital Stewardship Alliance levels of digital preservation, because essentially digital preservation is your digital disaster planning. So this is going to help get you there. So it's a really great thing. But we'll go ahead and start with some of the questions that were pre-submitted. If anybody has any questions as we're going along, just go ahead and put them in the box, and I will keep an eye out for them so that Nancy can answer them. One of the first and very general questions was, and this maybe is for one of the ALA organizers. Where can people find the transcript and not just the WMV file of resource titles, URLs, vendor contacts, etc., that were found in the 2010 webinar, so the webinar that you all viewed before coming to this session? I don't know if maybe, Nancy, you have the resources from that session that you might still be able to make available?
Well, what I could do is, since it was 2010.
It's been a while.
It's been a while. Is I can go back to those resources and make sure they're up to date and prepare a little handout or whatever, something to send out to everyone that's on this to make sure it's reposted.
Okay, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, and I'll just check to make sure that the URLs and everything are currently up to date.
Okay, so I sort of grouped some of these questions together, but we have one really sort of, I think maybe fundamental and broad question that we're going to start with is, how do you draw the line between an emergency and a disaster?
And that's why I have that little chart I referred to. It's really hard, and I think maybe best is if it's an emergency to me an emergency is if you can continue to keep your operation going and it only shuts down a part of your building, or a part of your collection and only some of your staff are involved. Sometimes what our conservator, who's now emeritus, he liked to call things critical incidents and not worry about what definition, but just the size. So I guess I would say emergency is when our department or a few people are pulled to deal with like a broken pipe or something that's not the entire building. If it's an entire building, it's a disaster. and it's impacting everyone. It's impacting your operations, and you're not able to keep the doors open.
Okay, that makes sense. And now we can go ahead and get into some questions that are a little bit more specific. One of the questions that came in is, given last year's water main break adjacent to the UCLA campus, how can we effectively pre-plan and coordinate with utilities to identify vulnerable infrastructure upslope from a library or archive?
That's a really good question. As someone pointed out to me today, we're downhill here. I think it's really difficult to anticipate all your different kinds of disasters. But this did bring attention to us that the water main breaks, a lot of water mains are now really old. So I think it's really, really good if you can, if you're a university, you probably have a risk management or something similar, and it's best to have discussions with them to find out who you need to talk to about this and how to, and to bring it to their attention and to help ask them to help you plan and prepare. So I mean, that's my, and if you are not on a university campus, then find out it's your city manager or your county emergency manager. Talk to them to see who it is that you need to work with on this. But otherwise, as with everything, be prepared for addressing whatever kind of disaster, and be flexible. But I've learned over the years, no one disaster only prepares you to be a little more flexible, but not give you the knowledge, the complete knowledge that you need to deal with the next one.
Okay. In a somewhat related note, I had this farther down on my list of questions, but I'm promoting it. How does one find the right people in a large municipal fire department who will be interested in getting building plans, seeing salvage priority lists, or doing on-site pre-disaster visits and consultations?
You know, I've found that they're always interested, but maybe someone has run into a roadblock that asked this question. So I think it's the best is to go to the fire chief and talk to him or her, or again go to your emergency manager, your county, and do some networking. But like I say, I haven't run into those roadblocks, but initiating conversation first is always desirable. And the way I pulled them in on my very first time was I asked for someone who would be willing to come and walk through the building with me to look at vulnerabilities. And that drew them in and got them interested and got our discussion going. So that might actually be a very first step, is to, I did that with both police, asking for advice on security issues, and I did that with the fire department. And it really established some really good working relationships.
That's really great to hear, because I know that when we do, and I assume when other organizations do their general preservation assessments, almost always like go and talk to your fire department and see if they'll do, what do you call it, fire extinguisher training and do a walkthrough with you. That's almost always a recommendation.
Yeah.
And it's good to hear people doing it.
Yes, and we love doing our spring fire, putting out fire exercise. That always is a good relationship builder.
As I say, it's a surprisingly fun team building thing.
It is. It is.
So we have another question, and I think this one's really interesting to me because it's sort of outside of my realm of experience. So it seems as though many larger institutions are moving towards implementing business continuity plans and larger scale emergency planning procedures that the libraries are required to comply with. One possible outcome is that the library might focus more on collections, recovery, and salvage, and allow for the business continuity plan and emergency planning to cover life safety and business operations. Do you have any thoughts about the benefits or challenges that might arise from separating out these sort of three core concerns into different plans?
I don't, because it does, I mean, hopefully there's somebody who is on all of those plans, so that there is such as, if you're lucky enough to have a preservation or conservator, preservation librarian, that can kind of make sure that there aren't competing or differing instructions. So that could be a problem. But in the past, before business continuity became recognized as a need, there was always an emergency plan which involved evacuating staff in a safe way, and then the disaster plan for the collections. But those two things did leave out the kinds of things that I showed on my first couple slides. It left out thinking about how to keep your online resources available. What should you be doing about your records, your business records? Unfortunately, we as librarians, at least I, never gave a thought about business records and only focused on collections. So it's good that we look at these things, but you're right, the person who asked this question is right, that there could be some challenges in having established different priorities within the different plans, and so those plans really need to be someone or a very small group reviewing the plans and making sure that they're going to work in concert.
Okay. All right. I'm going to move into questions just so we can cover a few different topics about vendors and sort of interested parties. So we have a question that says, I work at a small library where I can only count on 2 or 3 other people to help me with salvage. How do I figure out if I need the help of an outside vendor? And is there a threshold of cubic feet or like number of items that you'd recommend?
Well, I'd go back to that very first chart that talks about minor, medium, major, and it does depend on your size. We here have said, well, at first, before we got extra equipment, we said, okay, a minor incident or emergency is 200 books or less. We can handle 200 books or less. We can air dry them, we can freeze them, then we can, thaw them and air dry them at our own pace. And then we got more equipment, and we said, okay, we can handle 1,000 before we need to bring in things. So I think you need to figure out how much you can do on your own, and also are there people or resources in your community that you can pull in? So do you have a local library or university that could be pulled in to help and then figure out the numbers before you bring in an outside vendor? Like I say, we usually bring in an outside vendor when we hit 1,000, but I think you need to have your own discussions on that. Years ago, it used to be 200 volumes. If you're in a small library, I think I have a poll here that we could maybe look at. Let's see, that might help. If we want to do this poll, these are key players on a response team that I've got the name coordinator after each one, but really these could be volunteers that you assign to these different positions. And I think we could look at which ones you think should be Okay, looks like some are changing their minds, but looks like pretty much everyone is leaning towards the first four and not the entertainment coordinator. And entertainment coordinator, we don't need to be entertained during our response, but we may need a morale booster at some point. But these are positions that you need to think about, who you can pull in to help. You probably have technology. It might be someone on your board if you're a small institution. Security could probably be assigned to volunteers to check people in and out. You may want to have your board president be the public relations. You need to have somebody coordinate your volunteers if you get beyond and need a lot of help, and how to manage your volunteers. In 2008, we had 200 volunteers come. How do you handle that? You can elect to turn them away, or what I did was give groups of 8 people. I'd say, please come. Who's going to be the leader of this? I trained the leader in 5-10 minutes, and then turned them loose, so to speak, with only checking back once in a while. So you can, when you're a small library or museum, I know it's really hard, but if you, as this person has thought about, how do I figure out when to go to an outside vendor? These are other good things to think about. And you may want to talk to a local vendor and also have some larger regional or national vendors on your list. Hopefully that's helped.
Well, we actually have a sort of follow-up question from Karen, which it's interesting that you guys can handle 1,000 items now, because in the kinds of organizations that I work with, that's like an astronomical, unbelievable number. In fact, if they can do 100, that's wonderful. So Karen's saying sometimes we might be able to handle more than 200 items in-house, but sometimes it would just be better for the materials to outsource the salvage. So how would you balance that?
Well, good question. Like I say, so if I understand it, saying you could handle about 200. Is this what? I don't see
Might
it.
be able to handle 200, but maybe it would be better at times to do outsourcing in terms of material priorities, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's nothing wrong with saying that 200 is your cutoff point, because it's air drying is a lot of work, and so outsourcing. I guess my advice would be to get a vendor or two and call them up and ask them for estimates on freeze drying, packing up and freeze drying 200 items and 100 items, and make sure that your finance people understand that this will be needed. And let's see, I think I have here. Let me see, get this. Here I have a sample of how to pack out wet books. One of the things that what I've done several times while I'm working to find a vendor is to find a freezer truck or a place to freeze my items before I bring in a vendor. You may, with 200 books, decide even that's too much and have a local vendor assist in packing. But these are some samples of how books should be packed, spine down, especially if they're somewhat the same size. If they're really big, you may want to lay them flat, or you see down here where they've stood the box on the side and interleafed, and if your box isn't full, to pack things lightly around it. I don't know if hopefully that helps. The freezing is really, if you can find some place to pack and freeze and then outsource, that would be my best recommendation.
Well, I think I have a question sort of maybe associated with Karen's question. Are there particular materials that you would just suggest sending to a vendor if at all possible? Like, I don't know, like calendar papers or, art books, I guess. Or are there things that it would just be easier to send along? Barring being able to send everything, I guess.
Well, we've done a lot of, like you've kind of implied, where books that are slightly damp, we've just set up and that are just barely damp, set up and air dried. And then, especially like you've implied, the art books, the really oversized books, the fat books, those are really, really hard to air dry in a safe way. And if you've got glossy, getting those to a freezer right away, because they can tend to stick, because those would be some of the ways that I would sort out how I handled items.
Okay.
Does that?
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, in a similar, since we're sort of talking about salvage and supplies right now, does it make a difference whether blotting paper, paper towels, boxes, and other paper products used in the long or medium term for water leak or flood cleanup are acid-free and lignin-free?
If you're in a disaster, you don't have time to sort through your materials. The only thing that you really need to be careful with is that you're not using paper that has any kind of printing on them. And the majority of printing, Xerox, copy paper, are acid-free, lignin-free. But no, I would say whatever's at hand, except something that's got printing on it. You don't want to use printed paper, printed newspaper. And mainly you just do the best you can with the resources that you have.
Okay. Let's see. Actually, a question had come in on the WUFU form right before we started that I forgot about. From Laura, what are the recommended resources for planning and presenting a tabletop exercise? So she's saying the cultural institution where she works has several buildings used for storing and exhibiting a vast array of collections. And the locations of the collections are spread across many acres, so it's a challenge to imagine the responses for all possible emergency scenarios. So sorry, go ahead.
Well, there are, I think, some tabletops. I really like the is it my aunt's Thanksgiving exercise that asks people to think about how they would respond if their aunt's kitchen caught on fire 2 days before Thanksgiving and they suddenly had 40 people and only two turkeys. It's a nice little exercise which I could send out. That's a nice little exercise just to get people thinking about how they would respond. We're currently working with our statewide emergency team to come up with some tabletops. So you might want to see if your county emergency or if your fire department have some tabletops. But you could also just, a lot of people recommend, and I think it's really, really good to just say, to come up with a what if. And, what if a tornado came through? What if a pipe broke? Just pick out a one what if scenario and have the group talk about how they would handle it. So what ifs are really, really good ways to work through things. But I'm guessing, Jessica, you have any tabletops in your bag?
I do very little with disaster planning. It's usually my colleagues.
Okay.
So off the top of my head, no, but I know that they've done a few and could probably provide resources for people. But, Nancy, are you thinking, so you're working with your local or regional emergency responders to prepare some tabletops? Do you guys think you might make them available to the wider public?
Well, I've got one from last year that I could, and we're working on one for this year that we will use this summer. And it'll be maybe similar to what this questioner is asking about. But this one last year was flood, and this year is going to be tornado. So yes, we could share that.
I think that would be really awesome.
And that could help people think about their what ifs and how. But I could definitely immediately. Well, not immediately. Next week, submit last year's tabletop.
Yeah, sometimes even just having that little prompt to get you started, thinking about how you would do it yourself is really all that it takes, probably. So that would be awesome.
Okay, I can do that.
Let's see. We have more questions. This is actually sort of tied into some of the questions that we've already covered, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So we recently had a pipe burst and a bunch of our books got soaked, but we didn't have the money to hire someone to dry them out. We did what we could to salvage as much as we could, but we were having trouble figuring out how to prioritize in a way that would mean that the maximum amount of the collection could be saved. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions that might have helped?
Well, the first is if at all possible, I keep going back to this, the number one is if you can get them frozen. Now, years ago, we had 200 books that were involved, and we didn't have the money, but we did find freezers that we could get all the books in. And now I'm telling tales here out of school, but it took us 2 years to air dry them. We just took a few books at a time, but we were lucky on this particular one that it happened real close to a checkout station, so we checked all the books out and were able to come up with a list and hand them off to bibliographers and let them tell us which ones were in priority. But otherwise, if at all possible, if you can freeze them and buy yourself time and then figure out how to prioritize. Otherwise, if you've got someone who really knows the collection, have them with you as you're working through the response. And and hopefully you have someone who knows what's easily replaced. That's another one. The other thing is if you can have in your head sort of these mental priorities of what's kind of considered rare, which may be considered, some places cut it off at pre-1850. If it's something really new, that's probably very replaceable. If it's something pretty local, you may want to salvage that above something else. And when you're responding to a disaster, the thing that everyone wants to do is to jump right in. So these questions of how to prioritize and what to do first, if you can take even 15 minutes to meet as a group and brainstorm and discuss what's first, second, third, that will, in the long run, save you a lot of time.
Okay. Let's see. Well, I'm going to move back into some earlier questions. So we had a question from somebody who works at a part-time at a very small public library and was asking if there are resources for developing just a really, really simple disaster plan if they don't have a lot of support.
And I would recommend, and that's where I can add, I'll add this in, but my recommendation is to get the emergency, it's called Emergency and Response Wheel. It's got a place to put your emergency numbers on, and if you don't have this emergency response and salvage wheel, I'll provide the link, but you can just put that in to a word search and it'll pop up. It's like $9 or $10. That's, your plan's almost written. It's, I think, it's in steps 1, 2, 3. It walks you right through it. When we had our flood in 2008, that's what the African American Museum curator used, and we salvaged over 90% of that collection. So it's, the other thing I would recommend is the pocket guide. I'm looking up to see if I can find the, it's
is that the COSA guide?
Yes, the COSA pocket guide.
So the Council of State Archivists pocket response.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. If you can, that's a fill in the blank that you can do right on your computer. It also lists 1, 2, 3 simple steps that you can do. Another thing that you can do is go to the D plan and not do D plan, but search through they've got really great how to respond to different types of material and to different types of disasters, and you can just print those. You can print those off, and you've got a little guide right there. Doing a disaster plan can be very, very time-consuming, and these tools can be really helpful. The other thing is that emergency and salvage wheel. I was trying to find this here. It's also an app now for Droids and Apples, and so you can have it on your cell phone also. So those are tools. I think probably number one is to get your phone list up and to be aware that your cell phone might go out, tower. or your landline might go out, your email might go out. So think about how you'll get in touch with your people, and not necessarily it's kind of a phone tree, but it's a contact tree. Who's going to contact whom? So that's probably your starting point, but I'd certainly get some of these tools.
I can say that I was actually bizarrely excited when I found out that the emergency, or what is it? I forget the response wheel was.
Emergency response in Salvage. Yes.
Yeah, when I found out that it was an app, I was really excited. Which is, I guess, you know, get excited about weird things when you're in preservation.
Yeah, well, it's really great to have, because mainly in an emergency you just need some prompt that causes you to take a deep breath and review what you need to do, and have a few phone numbers so that you can get started. I would do the wheel, the phone, your phone contact, and then the other things as you have time.
So we also had a couple of questions about mold, and I'm not maybe going to go into specifically the questions, but would you talk for a minute about how you identify mold, what you do if you have a mold outbreak, you know, a not uncommon consequence of a water disaster?
Well, I was hoping, and if no one asked a question, I was going to pose it. Talk about mold. It used to be that you need to know, in literature, that you needed to know the type of mold. Basically, you just need to know that it's mold. You can usually tell because it's got little fluffy things around it. But sometimes I've had people say there's mold and it's dirt. If you can locate an industrial hygienist who can, or someone that can do lab work to positively identify it, but because they do come in all colors in there. If it's a current event, it will smear. It will be smudgy. My recommendation, because I made a mistake and didn't take this advice, is to assume it's mold. I walked into a situation where I assumed that the person didn't know what they were talking about and got overexposed and ill. But you should assume that it's mold and find out if you're at the university, you probably have someone that you talk to your risk manager. Otherwise, look for an industrial hygienist who can help you confirm that it's mold. And then once you do, you need to track down what the mold problem is. And we had a case that was really, really difficult because these little M's were where the mold outbreak was. You can see it's very random. So we charted it and then looked for the cause, and we found out that there were some vents that weren't working and some that were. So it turned out that we had some randomly vents that weren't working. And we won't go through this because this is going to be available for you after the session, but this is a really good first step on how to get rid of mold, and the things that can be salvaged and the things that can't, and simple things that you can do, but mostly let it dry and brush it off or use a damp rag. But whatever you do, make sure you take proper safety precautions and have a mask on and gloves and work in a well-ventilated area, or bring in somebody who has been trained to deal with mold, and don't take the health risk.
Absolutely, that's something that we're often talking about when we're visiting institutions is you know, and this is a question that comes up a lot, is how do I deal with mold? And it's like, well, make sure you have your personal protective equipment, and don't expect anybody who is in any way immunocompromised to do any of these things. and people who are already sensitive, which anybody who works in historic collections probably is already sensitized to some extent.
Yes, if they haven't, they're going to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, again, when do you bring in a vendor? If it's 10, just a handful, then consulting and figuring out who can help you. If it's beyond that and major, then you're going to need to call in a vendor and work with them because they have the equipment to do it safely.
Sure. So we're getting close-ish to time. So
Yeah.
I wanted to remind people that if you have any questions about your specific situation, now is your chance. I mean, you can always get in touch with any of us in the future as well, but right now you would be more than welcome. You have a few minutes. In the meantime, while we wait with bated breath, Nancy, since we're talking about vendors for mold, but just in general, are there any that you would suggest? Are there kinds of things that people should be asking to make sure that the vendor is right for them?
I was thinking about that, and you should really interview. Okay, so let me back up. Most vendors have a link to a national, and they probably respond. You're probably going to work with a regional or local office, and as you probably know, as with any service, a lot of it depends on your local. So I encourage, just asking, what kinds of disasters have they dealt with, and just have a conversation what are your credentials, what is your background, what have you worked with, and I think what I should do is I did a little article on just these questions, and I'm going to send that out to also have it posted, because it has a nice little series of how to work with the vendor. But I've always asked, what's your background, and just chatted with them to see if it's even a personality that I can work with. Mm-hmm. That's really important. Make sure that they're not people. Ask if they've worked with library collections. And be really careful if they start talking to you about having to use chemicals to solve the problem. That's my number one red flag. If they start talking to you about chemicals, if they start using language that you don't understand, they should be able to talk to you on a person-to-person level and not try to overwhelm you with how great they are, the chemicals that have to absolutely be used. Those kinds of things are definitely red flags.
Okay. So we had, I know that you had additional polls. I don't know if you wanted to run them. We also had a question about whether there might be vendors in New York that you can think of off the top of your head.
Hi, Tim. I've worked with a variety, and like I said, if they talk about chemicals, I don't. I worked with BMS. I'm a little hesitant to recommend any one a company, but I was, like I say, chat with them ahead of time, and there is movement within the community. So I had two people that I really loved working with in one company, and then they moved on to another company. So it kind of tends to be a little bit fluid. But if you want to send me that question after this, I'll make sure I connect with that person.
Okay. And we just had a question come in. Could you explain the freeze drying process, especially for small batches?
Well, Okay, so there's two good questions. There's freezing, and freeze drying. So if you freeze, just put it in your regular freezer. If you leave it in for years, it'll eventually freeze dry because you have a self-defrosting freezer, which is the way freeze drying works. It will quickly heat up and allow the water to the ice to go direct to vapor. It's called sublimation. I still don't have that word quite right. Sublimation. Anyway, if you leave your water in an ice tray the ice in your ice tray long enough, your ice will eventually disappear. That's freeze drying. What you can do is freeze your material and then call a company to see if you can get it sent out to get it freeze dried. What that allows is for the book, it's a safer way to dry a book, because if you freeze and air dry, which is fine, it will go through the thawing, and it's a little harder on the spines because there's expanding and contracting. It can be hard on the glues and everything, but we've done it many, many times, the air drying after it's been frozen in a regular freezer, and it's just fine. It takes a little extra time because you have to keep interleaving and fussing over the book. So I'm glad you asked, because I'm talking about putting things into a freezer, your home freezer, and then sending it off to a freeze dryer that then would just dry it for you in a freeze dryer. And I think if you just got a small amount, the biggest expense might be your transportation to get it to a freeze dryer company, a disaster facility. So I would call and consult. I've got this slide up about conquering smells. That question comes up a lot, and these are two products, especially this Gonzo that was designed for pets, that's worked really well for. We put it into tea bags, which you can buy, and then put it in with the material in a box, or generally in a box with the books. It's really helped a lot. And the Star Bright is more for room. It's developed for marines, for boats, to keep down mold and mildew. We've used both of these products, and they're not very expensive. So if you've got like soot smell and all of that, these are a couple products. So did we have any other questions? Allison or Jessica, did we have any more questions?
Sorry, I muted myself and then forgot to unmute.
Uh-oh.
We did have a couple more questions.
Okay, let's go to that.
So we have another vendor question. How about vendors recommended by insurance companies? This is from Catherine. She says she knows larger institutions would not be dealing with this necessarily, but a smaller institution might be in a position where a cleanup service is being recommended by an insurer. Is there anything to look at?
Again, yes, you're right. You do need to work with your insurance company to make sure that you're in sync, and we did that with the 2008 flood for the textile collection of the Czech Museum. Ask to make sure that whatever company you're being asked to use, make sure that they have worked with collections, with library collections, with museum collection, whatever kind of collection you have. Then ask them to present you with a protocol. How are they proposing to deal with your collection? And you can use that then and here I've got a phone number up here. Did I miss some numbers? It looks like I'm missing a number. To call and share the protocol with somebody else, a preservation librarian, a conservator. You can call AIC CERT to get somebody, but get them to spell out for you what they plan to do, then run it by someone. Preservation librarian, a conservator, someone at NADCC or AIC CERT, or and that's the best thing to do. Then you, if it looks like they're not using the right protocol, someone can help you formulate why this isn't going to work, so that they give you words to use with your insurance provider.
That's great. And I will mention that, AIC has a great 24-hour assistance. We at NEDCC also offer 24-hour disaster assistance, so you should have plenty of places to go, even if you find something, in the dead of night, all of a sudden. We did have one more question. Are there special considerations for things like sheet maps, photographs, LPs, other audio formats, and I would even throw in there other AV formats in general, just everything, just all the other hard stuff.
There are, and the number one thing that you can do is, if you don't have these things in the appropriate containers, the odds of something surviving a disaster are significantly reduced. For instance, the LP, 78 LP, 45, 5,000 record collection from the Czech Museum, he had the majority all packaged the way it's recommended, in sleeves, in boxes. It kept them upright. It kept, although they got wet, it kept them their shape. He had some that he hadn't processed yet, in just loosely in a box, and those were totaled. So number one is to get things packaged correctly. The other thing, again, is if you're in a disaster and you're dealing with these special materials, like you just listed, do call and one of these, NEDCC or AICERT or somebody, and get them to talk through the special considerations for your particular item. And some of it might depend on how much is involved. I just saw something that on glass plate negatives. Now they're saying it's okay to freeze. Photographs are okay to freeze. But a lot of things like the records, we just kept them wet, which goes against all kind of what you would think. So, and if you can get things backed up, but do consult with textiles, whatever you run into. We've got fabulous consultants across the U.S. that are willing to take time to talk to you, and we've got systems in place to get you connected. So, are there any other questions? I didn't ask a couple polls that I had planned. Let me take just a couple minutes, and then I can let everyone go. I wanted to review. I've lost my sheet here. I wanted to talk briefly, so let me do that and then we'll wrap up. Working with volunteers, you need to make sure that you screen your volunteers for health issues. Ask them if they have any health issues. You might have someone who is restricted. You can have them check in instead of doing heavy lifting, so find out what they're able to do log a volunteer in and out. Make sure that you enforce rest periods. The other thing when dealing with media, appoint a person that you can send everyone to answer the questions. They're always going to push you for dollar amount, and you should push back and say you don't know yet. So those are it, and I think that we should wrap this up and let Jessica do a conclusion.
Okay, well, I'm actually going to turn it over to Allison Armstrong to do the closeout, but thank you all for listening to us. Okay, Allison, if you're ready.
So Allison can't unmute. So I just want to thank all of you. Yeah. So it's up to us, Jessica. So I just want to thank all of you for taking time to look at the video ahead of time.
Can you hear me?
Okay, great. Yes, we can.
So I want to thank Nancy Kraft for sharing her preservation knowledge with us today, and Jessica Bitely for moderating and offering her knowledge as well. I want to thank all of you for attending this webinar and our tech support for recording it. We hope you'll look for future ALCTS programs, and please fill out the evaluation when you receive it to help us develop more programs that you're interested in. And again, thank you for coming.